These videos are based on real events, experiences, and accounts. However, all names, locations, and identifying details have been deliberately changed to protect the privacy and safety of those involved. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the channel. These stories are meant for late nights, quiet rooms, and headphones on. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin the first story. It was February 2014 when a small group of Finnish cave divers decided to test their skills on Norway's rarely explored Fjellstrom Cave. The cave had a fearsome reputation locally. Its underwater passages were narrow, frigid, and labyrinthine, stretching for hundreds of meters beneath the frozen landscape. Yet despite its notoriety, the team felt ready, or at least they told themselves they were. Leading the expedition was Marko Lehtinen, a 46-year-old diver whose experience was both extensive and tragic. Just a year earlier, he had lost his longtime dive partner in a separate cave accident in central Finland. The memory of that loss lingered in his mind, and yet here he was, preparing to descend into one of Europe's most challenging underwater cave systems. Alongside him were 4 other elite divers: Jonas Kallio, 42, known for his meticulous planning; Eero Väisänen, 40, a skilled technical diver; Lauri Mäkiala, 34, calm under pressure; and Sami Rantanen, the youngest at 33, ambitious and eager to prove himself. Their plan was deceptively simple: enter Fjellstrom through its partially submerged river entrance and navigate a network of underwater tunnels to emerge at a second opening on the opposite side of the system. In reality, success depended on near-perfect timing, precise navigation, and a complete absence of mistakes. The cave system was the deepest known in Northern Europe, with a recent discovery connecting the 2 entrances. No one had navigated it fully in one go, so there was little to rely on beyond maps hastily drawn from previous incomplete expeditions. The descent began with a triangular hole cut into the thick river ice, allowing the divers to slip below the surface. The team split into 2 groups to maximize safety. Jonas and Eero would descend first using underwater scooters, conserving energy and allowing sediment to settle for clearer visibility. Marko, Lauri, and Sami followed 2 hours later. Even in the initial stretches, the cave's cold and murky water was oppressive. Sunlight penetrated barely a few meters, and visibility was limited to the glow of the divers' flashlights. The first section of the cave descended gradually, offering a sense of reassurance. After 500 meters and a 34-meter drop, the divers reached an air-filled chamber over 250 meters long, a rare moment of reprieve in a descent otherwise dominated by narrow tunnels and crushing water pressure. They paused briefly to check equipment and catch their breath. The passage ahead was steeper, darker, and more restrictive. Any error here could prove fatal. For a fleeting moment, they allowed themselves to believe the cave might be manageable. But Fjellstrom was merciless. The next section narrowed to a nearly impossible squeeze, a sharp turn through a passage so tight that even a fully equipped diver could barely maneuver. Jonas decided to go first, guiding the way while keeping his flashlight trained on the narrow walls. Suddenly, Eero's light began to flicker erratically. Panic immediately set in. One of his bailout cylinders had caught on the jagged rock, preventing forward movement. Jonas tried to calm him, guiding him carefully and adjusting the equipment to free him, but in caves like this, panic spreads quickly. At those depths, even minor mistakes become deadly. Before Jonas could react further, he noticed Eero's regulator had dislodged. He forced it back into place, but the damage was irreversible. Water had entered Eero's lungs, and he went limp, his body suspended unnaturally in the icy current. Jonas couldn't afford to dwell on the horror. Remaining calm was the only way to survive. He checked his dive computer and realized with growing dread that the dive would now take far longer than planned. The previous estimate of 5 hours had ballooned to over 9. Staying longer increased the risk of hypothermia, nitrogen narcosis, and decompression sickness. Marco and the rest of the team, unaware of the unfolding tragedy ahead, began their descent 2 hours later. What they encountered in the narrow passage defied belief. Eero's body blocked the tunnel. Sami froze, eyes wide in shock, and Lowry's breathing became rapid and erratic. Marco tried to maintain composure, guiding them carefully around the hazard, but the narrow space and chilling current compounded the risk. Panic in a tight underwater space is a killer. Lowry's fear overcame him first. He struggled violently, his limbs flailing, and water rushed into his regulator. Marco held him, attempting to restore calm, but the damage was done. Another life claimed by the merciless cave. Sami, witnessing both deaths, was paralyzed by fear, but somehow managed to push forward, following Marco to safety. By the time Marco himself navigated back through the narrow sections, he realized the grim tally. 2 friends lost, the rest of the team scattered in the labyrinthian cave system, each unsure of the other's fate. The cave had claimed 3 of their number, leaving the remaining survivors to escape under conditions that pushed human endurance to its limit. Hours passed as Marco made his way towards the surface, alone. Cold seeped through his suit, and every muscle screamed in protest, but Fjellstrom offered no mercy. Survival demanded focus, patience, and the ability to ignore overwhelming fear. By the time he broke through the ice into the pale twilight above, he was exhausted, nearly numb from the cold, but alive. Jonas emerged shortly after, followed by Sami, the youngest, who had somehow navigated the treacherous passages without incident. They were all battered, shaken, and haunted by the losses that had occurred mere meters away. The narrow escape from Fjellstrom was not a triumph, but a grim testament to the dangers of underwater caves, places where even experience and preparation can be rendered meaningless in an instant. Back in the van, wrapped in blankets and shivering, Marco couldn't stop replaying the events. He had seen death firsthand, felt it brush against him in the pitch-black depths. Fjellstrom was not just a cave, it was a predator, indifferent to skill, strength, or courage. And as the van drove away from the frozen river, Marco knew the memory of that dive would never fade. The images of his friends lost in the icy water would haunt him forever. The survivors would later recount the dive in painstaking detail to authorities and fellow divers, emphasizing the importance of caution, preparation, and respect for the environment. No map, no plan, no amount of expertise could entirely mitigate the inherent danger of such extreme caves. For those who venture beneath the ice and into the labyrinthian tunnels of Europe's deepest systems, Fjellstrom serves as a reminder. The margin for error is razor thin, and the price of mistakes is paid in full. Even years later, when Marco recounted the events to close friends or wrote in his personal logs, the fear remained palpable. It wasn't just the deaths or the treacherous currents. It was the realization that nature, in its coldest and most unyielding form, can strike without warning. Fjellstrom had taken lives, shattered nerves, and reminded everyone involved that courage alone is not enough. One misstep in that darkness, one small lapse of judgment, and the cave will claim you, silently, without remorse. The Fjellstrom dive became a case study in the cave diving community, a chilling example of how a single incident can cascade into a chain reaction of death and panic, even among the most skilled divers. Dive instructors referenced it, survivors spoke of it in interviews, and the incident etched itself into the annals of European caving disasters. But beyond the statistics and reports, the human toll, the terror, the grief, and the confrontation with mortality remained deeply personal, a haunting shadow on the lives of those who lived to tell the tale. After surfacing from the icy river entrance of Fjellstrom Cave, Marco, Jonas, and Sami clambered into the waiting van, shivering violently and utterly drained. Their wetsuits clung to their bodies, icy water dripping from gloves and masks, a grim reminder of the hours they'd spent trapped in the cave's depths. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional stutter of the van engine. Each knew what they had just survived, and each understood the cost. 3 of their friends had not made it. The road back to their base camp was tense. Every bump in the snowy path made Marco flinch. He kept replaying the moments in his mind. Arrow's wide eyes as water filled his lungs, Lowry's panicked thrashing in the narrow passage, Sami squeezing past bodies and debris, every breath a struggle against the pressure of both water and fear. Fjellstrom had a way of marking survivors, and the mental scars were already forming. Once back at the small cabin where they had staged their dive, they quickly stripped off wetsuits and layered themselves in dry clothing. A hot thermos of tea was passed around, but it barely helped. The warmth didn't reach deep enough to thaw the icy tension lodged in their muscles. Marco sat on a bench, staring blankly at the frost-covered window, trying to come to terms with what had happened. The cave had been more than a challenge. It had been a gauntlet of death. The realization that even the smallest misstep could kill was now ingrained in him. After a few hours, they began debriefing. The survivors went over every part of the dive, dissecting the equipment failures, the miscommunications, and the narrow passages that had turned lethal. Jonas, normally meticulous and calm, admitted he had panicked briefly when Arrow's regulator came out. Sami confessed he had considered giving up at one point, but instinct had forced him forward. Marco listened quietly, analyzing every detail. He had to understand, not just to survive, but to prevent future divers from meeting the same fate. The discussion eventually turned to the bodies left behind. Recovery was impossible in the conditions, and there was no point in lingering. Fjellstrom would not forgive those who lingered. They had to accept that their friends were gone. Marco closed his eyes, forcing himself to imagine them in peaceful surroundings rather than trapped in the cold, narrow tunnels. Yet, even as he tried, the mental images remained. Arrow's empty gaze, Lowry's panicked face. He knew this memory would haunt him forever. In the days following the dive, the survivors returned home, but life had already changed. Marco couldn't sleep without dreaming of the cave's oppressive darkness. Jonas developed a constant tension in his shoulders, a reflexive response to imagined tight spaces. Sami avoided even shallow water, flinching at the thought of being submerged. Each of them had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. Fjellstrom's power wasn't just in its water and rock, it was in its ability to crush human resolve, leaving survivors physically intact but emotionally scarred. Despite the trauma, the team felt compelled to share what happened. They reported their experiences to the European Cave Diving Council, providing detailed notes about every obstacle, every bottleneck, and every narrow passage that had contributed to the tragedy. Equipment manufacturers also took note, particularly regarding regulators and bailout systems that had failed under extreme conditions. Fjellstrom had exposed weaknesses in human preparation as much as in mechanical gear. Months later, Marco returned in his own mind to the final moments of the dive. He remembered the disorienting darkness of the narrow tunnels, the relentless pressure of the water, and the suffocating silence that came with isolation underwater. The cold had been brutal, but fear was even more suffocating. He recalled the exact moment he surfaced and saw the open sky, the pale light of the Norwegian winter. Relief had surged through him, but it was intertwined with grief, with a gnawing sense of guilt. Survivors often feel that way, he realized. The shadow of "why me" looms larger than any memory of danger itself. For Jonas and Sami, the experience remained vivid, etched into their memories in ways that ordinary trauma could never replicate. Jonas recounted the moment he had freed Arrow's cylinder only to see his friend's body go limp. He confessed during one interview, "I couldn't do anything. Even if I'd had another cylinder, another second to react, nothing would have changed. You can prepare for cold, for pressure, for darkness, but you can't prepare for death happening right in front of you." Sami, the youngest, reflected differently. His survival felt like both a miracle and a curse. He had followed Marco through the tightest passages, maneuvered past bodies of friends and obstacles, and reached the surface without a scratch, but he couldn't shake the feeling that at any moment the cave could have claimed him too. That lingering fear made everyday life, showers, pools, even driving past frozen rivers, an exercise in vigilance. Marco, despite his experience, admitted that the dive had shaken him in a way nothing else could. His previous loss of a partner had haunted him, but this collective tragedy intensified the guilt. "You feel like you owe them something," he said. "You survived, they didn't. It's an emptiness that stays with you." Fjällström doesn't just take lives, it leaves survivors with pieces of themselves missing too. The incident spurred discussions in the wider caving community about the limits of human capability and the ethics of extreme exploration. Should divers continue to pursue these deadly passages? Was the knowledge gained worth the risk? Many argued that caves like Fjällström were fundamentally unpredictable and that no amount of skill or preparation could eliminate the inherent dangers. Others contended that understanding these systems advanced science and survival techniques. Marco and his team were less concerned with theory. They were focused on survival and memory. Years later, the dive was still referenced in cave diving circles as a cautionary tale. Novice divers were warned even experts can be overwhelmed by nature's extremes. Survival is not about courage alone, nor about planning alone. It is about understanding that sometimes the environment itself is an enemy. Fjällström remained unchanged, a silent, icy labyrinth, indifferent to human ambition. Those who enter must respect it fully, or pay the price. For Marco, Jonas, and Sami, Fjällström's shadow was permanent. They each coped differently. Marco took to writing detailed guides and risk assessments for divers attempting similar caves, ensuring his friends' deaths were not in vain. Jonas became an advocate for improved safety systems, emphasizing equipment redundancy and emergency protocols. Sami, while initially retreating from diving entirely, later returned with a focus on cave photography, documenting landscapes without risking life in the most extreme passages. The psychological scars, however, remained constant. Marco often awoke in the middle of the night, eyes wide, feeling the icy grip of deep water on his limbs. Jonas would have involuntary shivers when he thought about tunnels too narrow to turn in. Sami, on the rare occasions he returned to a cave, did so with an ever-present awareness of mortality. Fjällström had not only tested their physical limits, it had etched itself into their minds, a constant, haunting reminder of the thin line between life and death. In the end, the Fjällström expedition became more than a story of survival. It became a study in human vulnerability, a meditation on the risks we willingly take to explore the unknown. The team's ordeal illustrated how extreme conditions amplify human error, how panic spreads faster than oxygen can be replenished, and how nature, in its purest form, is indifferent to human bravery. They survived, but survival came with a price: trauma, grief, and the unshakable knowledge of the friends they could not save. Marco often said in reflection, "We weren't heroes, we were survivors, that's all." Fjällström doesn't care about courage or skill, it only knows the law of consequence, and we learned that the hardest way possible. The cave still stands, icy, dark, and silent beneath Norway's winter landscape. Few dare to enter its depths, and fewer still return. For those who have faced Fjällström and lived, the experience is a warning etched in memory. Nature is patient, unforgiving, and indifferent. The cave claims what it wants, when it wants, leaving only survivors to carry the weight of remembrance and to tell the tale of what happens when humans venture into the heart of darkness. On a cold September morning in 2018, a team of elite cavers from Russia and the UK gathered near the remote slopes of the Abkhazian mountains. Their goal was to explore the treacherous depths of the recently surveyed Vostok Cavern, a labyrinth that plunged over 2,200 meters into the earth. Only a handful of explorers had ever reached the bottom, and fewer still had returned unscathed. The cave was a monument to extremes: narrow vertical shafts, icy water, and endless passages that twisted and disappeared into blackness. Leading the expedition was Pavel Demidov, a veteran caver whose calm precision had carried him through dozens of extreme environments. Alongside him were his longtime Russian colleagues, Ivan Petrov, Sergei Mikhailov, and Marina Kuznetsova. Joining them for the first time were British cave photographer Rob Shorn and his assistant Jeff Wade, eager to document the cave's alien terrain. Their mission was twofold: explore and photograph the subterranean landscape, and collect biological samples of the rare species that thrived in complete darkness. Preparation took weeks. Each caver hauled over 30 kilograms of gear, ropes, lights, thermal suits, dry food, and scientific equipment through rough mountain terrain to the cave entrance. The wind bit sharply at exposed skin, and frost coated every surface. No one spoke much during the final ascent to the entrance. Words felt superfluous in the presence of the vast unknown. The gaping mouth of Vostok Cavern yawned beneath them, a dark vertical tunnel that disappeared into shadow. The descent began cautiously. They rigged ropes through narrow vertical shafts, lowering themselves slowly to avoid slipping on the wet rock. The first 30 meters dropped straight down, deceptively simple compared to what lay ahead. Beyond the initial shaft, the cave narrowed, forcing the team to squeeze through twisting tunnels lined with jagged rock. Every step required careful attention. One wrong move could result in injury or death, and at this depth, help was impossible. By the end of the first day, they had reached Camp 1, 600 meters below the surface. Exhausted, the team set up their base, a small clearing of flat rock where they could rest, eat, and dry off. The cave's temperature hovered just above freezing, and condensation from their own breath formed a thin mist around the camp. For many, the realization of just how isolated they were began to sink in. They were far from the surface, far from sunlight, and a place where the outside world no longer existed. The following days were a grueling mix of crawling, climbing, and swimming through icy subterranean lakes. Pavel led the way, assessing routes and securing anchor points for the team. Rob and Jeff documented everything, capturing surreal rock formations and the bioluminescent creatures that had adapted to eternal darkness. Each day took its toll, fingers and toes numb from cold, muscles cramping from extended periods of crawling through narrow passages. The cavers endured the slow, creeping fatigue that comes from prolonged exposure to extreme environments. By day 6, they had reached the deepest camp yet, nearly 2 kilometers below the surface. Here, the cave opened into a massive chamber with a turquoise lake, illuminated by their headlamps with an otherworldly glow. The team paused to breathe, marveling at the strange ecosystem thriving in total darkness. Tiny shrimp and blind scorpions scuttled along the lake's edges. Every photo, every sample collected was a triumph, a glimpse into a world untouched by sunlight or human interference. For a moment, the perils of the descent seemed secondary to the wonder surrounding them. But that calm was short-lived. On day 7, a routine check-in via cable line revealed an ominous warning. 2 cavers who had left the cave to catch a flight reported that water levels at the entrance were rising unusually fast. Flash floods in caves are notoriously unpredictable, and Pavel's experience told him delay could be deadly. Still, the team initially remained calm. Water surges were common in Vostok, often lasting only a few minutes before retreating. They continued their work, sampling and photographing, trusting that nature would follow its usual rhythm. It didn't. Minutes later, the chamber began filling with water. First a trickle, then a torrent. The lake that had seemed so tranquil became a violent, churning force, cutting off paths they had relied on during the descent. Pavel quickly assessed the situation. The narrow exit routes were flooding, and any hesitation could trap them underwater for hours. The cavers scrambled, suiting up and clipping into ropes that offered a tenuous route to higher ground within the chamber. Rob and Jeff were first to respond. They secured themselves to anchor points and began the painstaking climb through partially submerged rock, water buffeting their bodies and making every movement a battle. The current was strong, pushing them sideways and threatening to dislodge ropes that were their only means of escape. Hours passed, every second measured in precise movements to avoid exhaustion. Their minds were focused entirely on survival, the thrill of exploration replaced by the primal instinct to live. Behind them, the Russian team faced similar challenges. Some passages were already submerged, leaving only narrow ledges and rocky protrusions to cling to. Pavel barked instructions, his calm voice cutting through the roar of rushing water. His leadership kept them from panicking, though tension was palpable. Every caver knew that a single misstep, letting go of a rope, losing footing, or being struck by debris would be fatal. Yet panic wasn't just a risk, it was a weapon of the cave, and resisting it required every ounce of mental control. Eventually, after hours of grueling movement, Rob and Jeff reached a higher, relatively dry section. Exhausted and soaked to the bone, they secured themselves and waited, hoping the rest of the team could follow. Minutes stretched into an eternity as they watched the faint flicker of headlamps approaching from submerged tunnels. The relief was immediate and overwhelming when Pavel, Ivan, Sergei, and Marina finally emerged. Each of them was shaking, limbs numb, but alive. Their reunion was wordless, the shared understanding of what they had endured sufficient in itself. Still, the danger was far from over. The flood was not yet fully receding. Pavel made the call. They could not linger. Every second counted. The team began the arduous ascent, climbing through twisting, slippery tunnels while water continued to rush around their legs and torsos. Energy reserves were nearly depleted, fingers numb, muscles trembling. The climb was slow, deliberate, and punishing. One miscalculation could end the expedition in tragedy. Finally, after nearly a full day navigating flooded passages, the team reached the exit point at 1,900 meters above the chamber. The cave had tested them in every conceivable way, their endurance, their patience, their mental fortitude. But they were alive, battered and exhausted, having survived conditions that would have claimed less prepared explorers. Even so, Pavel knew that the experience would leave a permanent mark. Survival in Vostok Cavern was not just a matter of skill, it was a matter of timing, instinct, and luck, all aligned against a hostile, indifferent environment. Once on the surface, the group collapsed on the frost-covered ground, catching their first real breath of open air in nearly a week. The surrounding mountains were silent, indifferent, as if Vostok had claimed its toll and allowed the survivors to return on its own terms. For Pavel and his team, the cave remained a formidable force, a reminder of nature's power and the fragility of human life. They had survived, but the memory of the flood, the narrow escapes, and the relentless cold would remain with them forever, a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to challenge the subterranean world. The floodwaters in Vostok Cavern had forced Pavel and his team to confront a truth every caver fears. In caves, nature doesn't negotiate. Every route they had relied on to descend now threatened to trap them indefinitely, and every decision had to be measured against the possibility of permanent failure. Once they reached the relatively dry ledge at 1,900 meters, there was a brief pause, enough to catch their breath, but not enough to relax. They could still hear the distant roar of the rising water echoing through the tunnels, a reminder that their struggle was far from over. Pavel took stock first, checking that each caver's harness was secure and that headlamps were functioning. Rob's hands were trembling from hours of gripping icy rock, and Jeff's thermal suit had begun to leak in several places, allowing water to chill him to the bone. Marina, usually stoic and precise, shivered uncontrollably, while Ivan and Sergei looked pale, their expressions drained of color. Pavel realized that to make it out, they could not allow exhaustion or fear to take control. Every movement needed to be deliberate. The first challenge was ascending through a narrow vertical shaft that had been partially submerged during the flood. Water was still cascading down in intermittent pulses, making the rock slick and dangerous. Pavel led the way, carefully testing every foothold before committing his weight. Rob followed close behind, his camera safely stowed, while Jeff and the Russians brought up the rear. Every climber had to contend not only with the physical strain of the climb, but also the psychological stress of knowing a single misstep could lead to a fall that no one could survive. Halfway up the shaft, Jeff froze. The current had surged unexpectedly, hitting him square in the torso. He struggled to maintain balance, the rope slipping slightly under his weight. Panic threatened to take over, but Pavel's voice cut through the roar of the water, calm and commanding. Focus, one step at a time. Keep your hands tight. Jeff obeyed, gritting his teeth, moving slowly, inch by inch. The ascent seemed to stretch into eternity. each second a battle between control and fear. Rob, meanwhile, noticed that Marina was beginning to lag behind. Her movements were jerky, her breathing rapid. He tried to encourage her, shouting over the noise of the water, but she could barely respond. Pavel noticed too and motioned for her to pause briefly, letting her regain some composure. Even a brief break, though, carried risk. The water level was unpredictable, and pausing too long could trap them once again. But there was no alternative. The team would have to wait until she could continue safely. Finally, one by one, they emerged from the shaft into a wider tunnel. The roar of the flood was still audible, but here the rock was less vertical, giving them a chance to catch their breath and regroup. Pavel quickly assessed their condition. Everyone was wet, exhausted, and hypothermic, but still alive. He knew the descent had tested them physically, but the climb back out would be just as merciless. From this point on, they had no choice but to move continuously. Stopping for too long was not an option. The next passage required crawling through a narrow, twisting tunnel that sloped sharply upward. Water still ran along its edges, pooling in pockets where they had to step carefully. Each caver moved in a single file, headlamps illuminating only the few feet ahead. Any misjudgment of distance or footing could result in injury. The cave seemed almost alive, indifferent, yet oppressive, pressing in from all sides. Pavel's strategy was simple: keep moving, stay calm, and maintain communication. Every shout, every hand signal mattered. Hours passed in this manner. The team pushed through mud, water, and ice, each section of the cave demanding precision and resilience. Ivan's gloves had worn thin, cutting into his hands, while Sergei's boots were soaked, leaving him in constant discomfort. Rob's headlamp flickered intermittently, making the shadows dance ominously on the walls. Every sound, the slap of water against rock, the drip of condensation, felt amplified in the cave's silence, a reminder that danger was never far. At one point, the water surged again, filling a narrow bend in the tunnel and forcing the cavers to retreat briefly to higher ground. The current struck like a battering ram, and for a moment, panic rippled through the group. Rob instinctively grabbed Pavel's harness, gripping tightly as the cold water tried to sweep him away. Pavel held firm, using the rope system to anchor the team against the force. Minutes passed like hours, but eventually the surge subsided. Every caver was drenched, shivering violently, but alive. As the group continued upward, fatigue became their constant companion. Every movement was slower, heavier, each step a conscious exertion of energy. Jeff was lagging behind again, struggling against the cold and exhaustion, and Marina's breathing remained rapid and uneven. Pavel reminded them to conserve energy while still maintaining steady movement, knowing that any loss of control could prove fatal. Slowly, they crept upward through the cave, the exit still unknown but always ahead. Finally, after nearly 20 hours from the initial flood, the team reached the base of the final ascent. This section was steep and jagged, requiring both strength and dexterity. They had to climb over rocks slick with water and ice, using ropes anchored through natural crevices. Each pull of the arms, each push of the legs brought them incrementally closer to the surface, but also deeper into the strain of the ordeal. Pain and exhaustion were constant, but the thought of survival drove them forward. Rob and Jeff went first, securing the rope system and testing the path for the Russians. One misstep could dislodge rocks or break an anchor point, and the potential for injury was high. The climb was grueling. The air in the cave felt thin and cold, each breath a sharp sting in the lungs. But inch by inch, they moved upward, their shadows dancing on the walls and the beam of their headlamps. When the Russians followed, the strain became immediately apparent. Marina's fingers were numb from hours of exposure to freezing water, and she struggled to grip the rope securely. Ivan's body ached from cramping muscles, while Sergei's boots trembled with fatigue. Pavel stayed close, guiding them and offering encouragement, reminding them to focus on their movements and maintain control. The cave demanded respect, and any lapse could turn this final climb into a catastrophe. Hours more passed in silence, broken only by effort and water. Every caver was mentally and physically depleted, but they pressed on. The exit was in sight, a faint glow of daylight filtering through the cave's mouth. For the first time since the flood began, hope sparked in their minds. The journey had pushed them beyond endurance, tested their courage, and forced them to confront the cave's unyielding power. Yet, even in this moment of near triumph, the memory of the flood and its unpredictability lingered, a stark reminder that nature's force is beyond human control. Finally, one by one, they emerged from the cave. The cold night air hit them like a shock, and they collapsed on the frost-covered ground, gasping for the warmth of the surface. The mountains around them were silent, indifferent, their peaks shrouded in clouds. They were alive, battered, and profoundly changed. Vostok Cavern had tested them in every imaginable way, and though their bodies ached and their spirits were drained, they had survived. Pavel took a long, steadying breath, surveying his team. Rob and Jeff were huddled together, shivering violently but laughing weakly at their survival. Marina wrapped herself in layers of thermal blankets, still trembling. Ivan and Sergei exchanged exhausted smiles, and Pavel allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had escaped a place that could have easily become their tomb. The experience would remain with them forever, not just as a story of survival, but as a testament to human endurance, caution, and the brutal power of nature. Even days later, as they recounted their ordeal to colleagues and friends, the memory of rushing water, submerged tunnels, and the unrelenting darkness of the cave haunted them. Vostok Cavern had proven that exploration comes at a cost, and survival often depends on far more than skill alone. It depended on timing, instinct, and a measure of luck that few could ever hope to control. And for Pavel and his team, that night in the cave would remain a story told in whispers, a reminder of the fine line between life and death, deep beneath the mountains. At 28, Erin always prided herself on being calm in situations where most people panicked. She had grown up in a small riverside town in Maine and spent countless weekends hiking and exploring the forests nearby. Yet nothing in her past had prepared her for the kind of fear that would creep in slowly like fog on that October night. She had agreed to babysit for a family she barely knew, the Carvers, at their old colonial house tucked into the woods. Their son, Liam, was 6, shy but polite, and they had given her clear instructions: bedtime by 8:30, lights dimmed, and check on him if he called. The house seemed ordinary enough when Erin arrived. It sat back from the narrow road framed by tall pines whose tips scratched at the moonlight. The porch creaked under her boots as she rang the doorbell. Mr. Carver answered, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a brisk handshake. Mrs. Carver was warm, thanking Erin multiple times for coming on such short notice. They went through the basics: dinner in the kitchen, bedtime routine, the usual rules about the locks. They were thorough, perhaps more than she expected, especially with the mention of keeping both deadbolts secured. Erin nodded, assuming this was just a cautious parent. After they left around 7 p.m., Liam bounced into the kitchen, a little bundle of energy. "Can we play hide and seek?" he asked eagerly. Erin hesitated, glancing around the old house. Its hallways stretched further than she remembered from the tour, with doors leading to rooms that seemed almost hidden in shadow. She suggested a compromise: board games on the dining table, then a short video game session in the living room. Liam agreed reluctantly, and for a while the evening flowed smoothly. He laughed at the game, and Erin felt her nerves settle. Dinner was a typical child's feast: chicken nuggets, macaroni, and a little juice. Liam ate quickly, distracted by the cartoon playing on the TV. Erin didn't correct him. She figured it was just one night, and she was here to make the experience as smooth as possible. Once dinner was finished, she helped him brush his teeth, guiding him up the narrow staircase to his room at the end of a long hallway. His bedroom was small, furnished with a bed pushed to the wall, a nightstand with a soft yellow lamp, and a corner closet with sliding doors. The room smelled faintly of lavender, a scent she associated with calm. After tucking him in, she read a short story from the little stack of books on his dresser. "Would you like me to stay in the hallway for a minute?" Liam asked softly. Erin agreed, standing just outside the door as he rustled with his blanket. After about 30 seconds, he seemed settled, and she stepped back, leaving the doors slightly ajar as the carvers had requested. Erin made her way down the hall to the spare room at the far end, where a simple bed and small TV awaited. She kicked off her boots, flipped on the television, and sank onto the bed, thinking the night would pass quietly. 40 minutes later, a soft sound in the hallway pulled her attention. Liam appeared at the doorway, rubbing his eyes and clutching his stuffed fox. "Erin?" he whispered, voice trembling. His face wasn't sleepy, it was frightened. Erin's chest tightened. "What's wrong, Liam?" she asked, keeping her tone calm. "The closet, it moved," he said, pointing toward the sliding doors. She forced herself to take a deep breath, convincing herself it was an ordinary household noise, the settling of an old house. Still, she walked back to his room to check. The sliding doors of the closet were slightly ajar. Erin slid one open and peeped inside, just clothes, bins, and the top shelf stuffed with folded sweaters. She pushed a few garments aside as if searching for something, though she knew nothing was there. Sliding the doors shut, she looked at Liam. "See, nothing to worry about," she said gently. He nodded, but the fear didn't leave his eyes. Erin returned to the spare room, trying to shake off a strange sense of unease. Minutes later, Liam appeared again, more agitated. "It moved again," he said, voice higher now. Erin froze for a fraction of a second before walking back toward his room. The closet doors were wide open this time. Her stomach dropped. She could have sworn she had closed them. Standing there, she felt an almost imperceptible pulse of dread. Something was wrong. It didn't feel like a child's imagination. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Did you open it?" she asked. He shook his head, eyes wide. Erin approached cautiously, scanning the room. That's when she saw it, a figure pressed against the corner behind the hamper. At first, it blended with the shadows, just a dark shape. Her mind struggled to process the size, the stillness. Then she saw the glint of shoes, the slight movement of a head turning toward her. The figure crouched impossibly close to the wall, trying to disappear completely. Time stretched, and Erin felt her chest constrict. There was no scream, no yell, just the awareness that something alive was hiding in Liam's room. Reacting purely on instinct, Erin scooped Liam into her arms, holding him tightly. She backed towards the door without taking her eyes off the figure. It remained still, almost daring her to move. Her mind raced. One wrong step could provoke it, and the thought of what might happen if it was armed made her grip Liam tighter. She bolted down the hallway to the spare room, slamming the door behind her and locking it. The familiar bedroom felt like a fortress, flimsy and inadequate, but it was all she had. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her phone, dialing 911. She whispered the address and explained the situation in fragmented sentences. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline, guiding her as she described the intruder's position. Minutes crawled like hours. Every creak in the hallway made her heart leap, every shadow outside the door seem alive. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens filtered through the dense night air. Relief mingled with lingering terror. The police arrived quickly, knocking gently at the door before entering. Erin held Liam close, eyes scanning for any sign of the intruder. They had searched the house from top to bottom, confirming there was no one else inside. Whoever had been in Liam's room had vanished into the night. When the Carvers returned to find flashing lights in the driveway, their gratitude was immediate but tinged with worry. Questions were asked about locks, about Liam's behavior, about Erin's actions, but there was little more to uncover. The intruder's presence was a mystery, a fleeting nightmare that might never be explained. That night, Erin could barely sleep. She stayed alert on the couch, Liam curled next to her, listening to the faint hum of the police cars still parked outside. Her mind replayed the scene over and over. The crouched figure, the stillness, the smallness of the space they had tried to hide in. It haunted her more than anything she had experienced in her life. By morning, she knew she would never babysit for the Carvers again. She would take other jobs, of course, but the memory of that night, of a child almost encountering a stranger hiding in his room, would linger indefinitely. Even weeks later, Erin found herself checking locks, leaving lights on, and glancing at closets with a heightened wariness she hadn't possessed before. She often thought of Liam and how quietly brave he had been, alerting her to danger she had almost dismissed. That night had taught her that instinct, no matter how small or seemingly illogical, should never be ignored, especially when it comes from a child. Erin's experience at the Carver house became a quiet lesson etched into her memory. Danger often comes where it is least expected, in spaces thought to be safe, and the courage to act decisively can be the difference between survival and tragedy. The dark, empty corners of that old colonial house remained a silent reminder that not every night is predictable, not every house is secure, and sometimes the shadows are more than just illusions. The morning after the Carver incident, Erin couldn't shake the feeling that something in that house hadn't been entirely gone. She kept replaying the image of the crouched figure behind the hamper, small yet impossibly still, its eyes staring out from the shadows. Even though the police had assured her the intruder had fled, part of her couldn't stop thinking that the house itself seemed to hold a memory of that presence. Weeks passed and Erin returned to her normal routine, but she noticed subtle changes in herself. Every time she entered a room with a closet or a dark corner, she instinctively scanned the space first. Shadows felt heavier, sounds sharper. Even the old bridge near her apartment, which she had walked countless times, felt less familiar, as if the world had grown just a little more dangerous. But she tried to push it aside, telling herself that fear had a way of exaggerating memories. Then, months later, a call from a local family friend brought her back to a situation that would make her realize the Carver night wasn't an isolated incident. The call was simple. "Can you babysit for a few hours tonight, just until we get back from a dinner?" It was only a short stint, but Erin hesitated, remembering the Carver house and the chilling feeling that came with it. Still, she agreed. This time, the family lived in a newly built townhouse near the river. The layout was modern, open, and well lit. The children, Abby and Tyler, were 6 and 8 respectively. They seemed like ordinary kids, playful, polite, and eager to show her their toys. Erin was reminded of Liam, and a knot formed in her stomach. She tried to shake it off as she followed the routine: dinner, homework, bedtime. Abby and Tyler's rooms were on the second floor, separated by a small landing. Erin tucked them in, checking their closets, making sure all doors were closed. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Yet by 9 p.m., Erin sensed it again. A small, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a subtle disturbance in the silence of the house. She shook her head, telling herself she was overreacting. The kids were asleep, the doors were locked, and the house was quiet. But then she heard it, a soft scuffling from Abby's room. Her pulse quickened. Slowly, she moved toward the sound, keeping her steps deliberate and quiet. When she peeked inside Abby's room, her heart stopped. A shadow moved near the corner closet, too large to be a child, too deliberate to be an accident. Erin froze. The figure was obscured by blankets and shadows, but she could sense its awareness of her. "Who's there?" she called softly, trying to sound calm. No answer came. Every instinct screamed at her to grab the children and run, but she knew if she made a sudden move, the figure might react violently. Erin took a deep breath and stepped closer. The figure didn't move, almost daring her to approach. Her eyes adjusted, and she saw it clearly this time, an adult crouched low, hiding behind the small dresser. Panic rose, but she forced herself to think rationally. There was a single exit, the door. She needed to get Abby and Tyler out without drawing attention. Moving slowly, Erin edged toward the children's beds. "Abby, Tyler, wake up, it's time to leave." The kids stirred groggily, rubbing their eyes. The figure shifted slightly, and Erin realized it was watching her, calculating. With adrenaline pumping through her veins, she scooped up Abby first, then Tyler, keeping her body between the children and the intruder. She backed toward the door, glancing at the shadow one last time. The intruder made no sudden move, but stayed low, as if waiting for the perfect moment. Erin didn't give them that chance. She bolted down the stairs, the children clinging tightly to her. The front door was locked from the inside, so she fumbled with the keys and threw it open, bolting into the street. Heart racing, she scanned the neighborhood, but no one followed. The house stood silent behind her, seemingly unaware of the chaos that had erupted within its walls. Once they reached the neighbor's house and Erin explained the situation, she called 911. Officers arrived quickly this time, sweeping the area and interviewing Erin and the children. They found no one inside, yet the sense of unease lingered. Erin couldn't shake the feeling that the intruder had not just been a random trespasser. The precision, the timing, the way they had hidden, it all suggested someone who had studied the house, someone who knew exactly where to wait and how to remain unseen. Over the following weeks, Erin couldn't sleep in unfamiliar rooms. Closets, dark corners, even the attic of her own apartment seemed to hold shadows that weren't entirely imaginary. She started carrying a flashlight everywhere, scanning hallways before entering, double-checking locks and doors. Her friends noticed the change. Erin was no longer the calm, composed person they knew. The nights of terror in the Carver house and now the townhouse had altered her permanently. She avoided babysitting for strangers entirely, taking short, familiar jobs for families she knew personally. Yet every time she passed a quiet suburban street or saw a darkened hallway through an open window, a shiver ran down her spine. Erin knew deep down that the events she had experienced were not isolated incidents. They were a glimpse into a reality most people preferred to ignore. Then came the final, unshakable lesson. One late autumn evening, Erin decided to confront the fear head-on. She volunteered to help set up decorations at a community center where she had grown up. The building was old, a brick structure with narrow hallways and a basement that had been used for storage for decades. Erin thought it would be safe, daylight, other people around, familiar surroundings. But as she moved boxes down a narrow hallway toward the basement, she sensed the presence again. A shadow flitted just beyond her line of sight. The hairs on her arms stood on end. She froze. This time, she didn't call out, she didn't run, she waited. And then she saw it. A figure low to the ground, moving carefully along the walls, watching her. Erin's chest tightened, but she remembered what had kept her alive before. Calm observation, decisive action. She grabbed a heavy flashlight from her bag, switched it on, and shined it directly at the figure. It froze, and Erin could see the eyes reflecting back at her. The intruder was not a child, not a playful imagination. It was a man, small in stature but purposeful in movement. He had been waiting in the basement, unseen. Erin didn't hesitate. She swung the flashlight with all her strength. The intruder flinched and stumbled backward, giving Erin the split second she needed to escape. She bolted down the stairs, heart hammering, shouting for help as she reached the main hall. Others arrived immediately, calling the police. The intruder had vanished, leaving only the echo of his footsteps in the basement. Erin stood there, breathing hard, holding the flashlight like a lifeline. She realized then that her life had changed forever. The experiences in the Carver house, the townhouse, and now the basement incident had left an indelible mark. She understood the truth. Danger could lurk anywhere, even in places that seemed familiar or safe. Erin never returned to babysitting strangers. She moved to a new city, far from the streets and houses that had haunted her. She took jobs that allowed her to work independently, with no children to watch, no dark hallways to navigate. And though time dulls the sharpness of fear, she never forgot the lessons she had learned. Trust instincts, act decisively, and never underestimate the hidden threats in ordinary places. Even years later, when she walked past a quiet street at night or glanced into a shadowed corner of a hotel room, she felt a twinge of that old, cold fear. Erin knew she had survived encounters that would have claimed others, not through luck, but because she had faced the unknown with clarity and courage. And in that knowledge, there was a strange comfort, a reminder that even in the darkest shadows, survival depended on awareness, quick thinking, and the refusal to dismiss danger as mere imagination. The night of terror and the Carver house had been the first lesson. The townhouse had been the second. The basement incident had been the final confirmation. Some places, some shadows could never be trusted. And Erin had learned the hard way that the ordinary world often hides the extraordinary danger just out of sight.